The 23rd of May, the Ukraine Media Center is on air. Yurii and Svetlana Chaprenko, we are discussing this morning the state of the affairs between Ukraine-Africa relations. We'll be talking about priorities, challenges, and the path forward. Today's panelists are Yurii Oliinyk is Non-Governmental Analytical Center for Ukrainian Studies. The ANS is represented by Dariia Panova, expert of National Advocacy Network. Dzvinka Kachur is joining us. She represents Ukrainian World Congress in Africa. Welcome. 2 days ago, the U.S. president, when he had learned that the President Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine learned that he was visiting South Africa, Donald Trump's reaction was, what the hell is he doing there? That's a paraphrase, but it seems to be symbolic of the work that Ukraine had started her work in that region. Of course, Russia is actively participating in terms of disinformation in that continent through the humanitarian assistance, spreading their narrative. The Ukrainian presence was not visible. What are the priorities of Ukraine? Who would like to begin? Mr. Mahda, perhaps you will begin. Thank you and welcome. Indeed, it seems to me that the African activities of Ukraine is quite simple, and the work of diplomatic corps there. The thing is that we have defined quite clearly our positions in Europe. We know who is our friend, who is foe. In Africa, it's like Yanukovych. You will remember Anna Herman's words said that President Yanukovych was quite a close person. It's like Africa. I hope the Africans will not be offended by such a reference. However, this is a continent where, in the first place, we see hundreds and dozens of members of UN. This is not the first time that I quote that message. The Russia-Ukraine war also is characterized by anti-colonialism, a message that is not well received in Ukraine. The stereotype is that we are close, our languages look like one another. We have common borders. What kind of anti-colonialisms are we talking about here? But when we talk about anti-colonial character of the Russia-Ukraine war, we bridge a path towards Africa, because apart from South African Republic, perhaps, and in some respect, Ethiopia, Liberia, the rest of the dozens of countries. This is an umbrella term that will cover all African countries because they were fighting for their independence. And to some extent, this is the way to disavow a current concept of the so-called white man's burden. This is the way to show that we are not related in any way to colonial politics that are so important for Africa. I agree, and I will follow up with this anti-colonial agenda. The liberation narrative was used by Russia in a disguised way in all their propaganda, and in particular in Africa they claim that they are agents of anti-colonialism, but they say that Europe was enslaving you, and we, like the Soviet Union, are liberating you. This is what China is doing. On the propaganda level, it seems to be working. The other question is, why is Africa important? President Trump's words are not to be taken seriously. He visited the continent himself. You know the issues with the South African Republic. We know about his populistic words about supporting white minority. This is a geopolitical message, which is very important. They want to preserve their relations with Europe. Why is African continent important for Ukraine? In terms of statistics, these are not specific estimation. We don't have specific estimations on the population in Africa. If in Ukraine, for example, we haven't had for 20 years, we haven't seen the census, but we understand that 1.5 billion people are living there. UN is saying that they will see growth to 2 billion people. So the growth of population is very important, meaning the markets, the industrialization, the development of new possibilities, new human resources and capital. Second point, diplomatic area. 54 countries are UN members, which makes 25% of voting countries, countries that perhaps UN is not now having a lot of impact on the world politics or world diplomacy. But in terms of a voice to be heard, this is important. A third point is Russia. What I'm saying about growth of population and the industrial growth in Eastern and South Africa, industrial potential is growing, and the China used to be the world's industrial center. We have different issues there. These are also relating to trade and the deposits of metals. Why is China interested in Africa? Because it's an additional sort of rare earths and petrol and, of course, natural resources, including woods in equatorial Africa, for example. So there is a lot of fight going on. India, Europe are all trying to enter those markets. The recent events show that Nigeria, for example, 1.5 years the junta is in power, and uranium is the source, natural resource for France, for example, providing nuclear resources for Europe. This is an important factor. Long-term perspective. For Ukraine, markets are important. Diplomatic front is important. Increasing our role and, respectively, the weakening of Russia narrative. Russia directly not only engaged in propaganda campaign, they also are trying to enter the market as a trading leverage. Countries are afraid of the flows of refugees, so Russia wants to be a world player and to be engaged in horse trading. Ukraine must look at herself as a global actor. Russia-Ukraine war is not something that is not very important. This is the source of the possible Third World War. Dariia, would you like to join in? These are very important messages. My point is that, and I follow up on what has just been said, the Russia-Ukraine war is growing beyond the borders of Ukraine and perhaps the western parts of Russia. What we are saying and seeing is that while Ukraine is fighting for its independence, it reaches the information space of other countries. In Europe, for example, we see that many countries are rooting for Ukraine, and supporting Ukraine, African countries are quite ambivalent. Ambivalent environment. That is to say, they are trying to circumvent in defining their position. They want to receive economic aid from Russia and not to upend the current status quo. The interest of Ukraine is not zeroed in on particular countries, but on the continent in general, including the informational space. It will be of notice here that 2024 will see the end of the campaign, informational campaign, but I believe this is one of the most important things, because those who are more vocal, who are more efficient in getting the message across, will be able to forge a Ukrainian agenda on the Ukrainian continent. Recent events in a year and a half in terms of policy and military campaigns, I think that we are doing better as compared to the information campaign. We know about the Sudan, where we are present in an indirect way. And of course, the drone developments, military developments are also part of the Ukrainian influence. We are working with the political elite, but what is lacking is the work with the population vis-a-vis the Russian information campaign. Let's now turn to Ms. Dzvinka to follow up. Ms. Kachur, what will you say on the issue that diplomatic focus of Ukraine has been centered on Africa? Thank you very much. Of course, I am so happy that Africa has appeared on the horizon on the foreign policy interests of Ukraine. It's very sad that it commenced only in 2022. Africa is the future. When we talk about the African continent, it is important to stress that this is the youngest continent. Well, these are the people that will define international politics, the future of the world in 20 or 30 years' time. The panelists mentioned that Africa has not defined herself. I will say the following. Africa has defined, and this is a position of non-alliance that does not seem to be evading. Of course, for the African countries, the UN agenda has never worked. The basis of United Nations Charter were forged after the Second World War. And those countries in Africa didn't enjoy independence until then. They were not able to impact the world agenda. In other words, for dozens of years, African countries were saying that the UN system is not perfect, it should be changed. Here, Ukraine can become, for Africa and for African Union, a strategic partner to reform the whole system. This is the point that Ukraine is defending, and this is critically important. Not that the UN system or international system is not working. The point is that this system should be working better. Indeed, 25% of the votes in the United Nations belong to the African nations, and it is important for fight for the influence on that vote. Thank you very much. Mr. Mahda, and one more remark. And by the way, when we talk about cooperation, we should understand and be aware of one simple point. Ukraine has to get rid of the stereotypes. What has been a stereotype regarding Africa? Foreign students, for example, international students, will they come for studies in Ukraine amidst constant air raid alerts? I'm not talking about quality of life or prices. I'm talking about the state of war. The export of armaments, they're not interested, the Africans are not interested in the remains of the Soviet arms. We are talking about new technologies. In that case, we should not be exporting through the private military enterprises. This is exactly what Russia is doing. We have disinformation as a separate point of discussion. What I am saying is that we should enjoy asymmetric actions. If we endeavor to compete with Russia or China, and China should be at the back of our minds, we will be talking about the fact that we have missed that train already. Nothing specific or constructive will happen here. Well, in that case, we've mentioned a couple of times the disinformation and information campaigns spread by Russia and China, countries that see Africa as an important area of influence. Here we should be candid that we are lagging behind vis-a-vis Russia and China. They provide medicine, build schools, and of course they mentally influence the minds of the population of Africa. Where is Ukraine now? Have we now realized that information impact is no less important than the diplomatic one? What are we doing to counteract such disinformation? We do a lot, and by the way, I would like to thank all the Ukrainians living in Africa, in particular in South African Republic, and all the public figures. They are doing a titanic piece of work. They talk to professors, to public figures, to policymakers, giving a lot of interviews. Many newspapers, including Kenya, there are a lot of articles about Ukraine. We understand that we are doing what we can with the resources available, monetary resources, the Sputnik system that is working in every African countries, delivering Russian programs and shows. The Congo, for example, not the Democratic Republic of Congo, but the Congo and the country of Cameroon. Billions of dollars are invested, and of course this will overshadow all our Ukrainian efforts, including the efforts by the foreign ministry. Of course, I agree that we should be acting asymmetrically. We should dispel the Russian narratives. They speculate that they're fighting NATO. They are liberators. We should be showing real facts. There is nothing to be made up. We should engage in conversation that we are fighting for our independence and freedom from neo-colonial intrusion. And sometimes we have to do the following. The situation in the world is complex, and we should distance ourselves from the policies of Europe and USA. We should get the message through that we are not sharing the vision of the future propagated by the West, because we know about the inequality of resources, the inequality of incomes. We should be critical of that, and we should engage in conversation that Ukraine is insisting on more harmonious way of development for all the countries, including the fight for freedom. We also root for the economic development of different countries. This is the message to get through and insist that we should be dispelling the myths. We see the facts of genocide in Ukraine, specific cases, what the Russians are doing in Mali, in Sudan, what the mercenaries are doing in Russia. And by the way, we see more and more examples when the people from Africa who came for study in Russia. There was a Senegalese in Saratov, and he signed a half-a-year contract with the military. He was sent to the front, and he was captured. This is an example of such a case, and different African countries are protesting such instances. We should share our vision to counteract Russian propaganda. Ms. Dzvinka, can I turn to you? Do you see Ukraine on the information map among the Africans? What do they know about Ukraine? What are the narratives? Do you see the narratives that are anti-Ukrainian? Now, of course, in the wake of 2022, Ukraine has appeared on the map of Africa. We didn't exist there because we were kind of part of a general picture of what used to be the Soviet Union. Now Ukraine has passed an important decision. They have opened 9 additional missions and embassies. And the embassy is an important factor for communication. This is where media can turn to get commentaries, and that increases the possibility of communication. One of the challenges is that the Ukrainians are not present. An average citizen of Zimbabwe or South African Republic doesn't know anything about Ukraine, the way they live, what they have for breakfast. This is a terra incognita for them. They have never seen Ukrainians. They have never talked to Ukrainians. What they were talking to were the Soviet people. Now we seem to be talking to other people, Ukrainians. So the fact that the embassies have been opened is quite a great achievement. In addition, it is important that direct contacts are established. Mr. Yurii has mentioned that. For Ukrainians, it is important to understand that Africa means 54 countries. When we say Africa, these are not the same people. Every country is a specific and unique culturally and politically. We should be looking at those countries from this vantage point. It's not like Europe a la carte. We distinguish between Scandinavian countries, Nordic countries, the Baltic countries. This also goes for Africa. North of Africa and South Africa are different countries historically and ideologically, and they will behave differently in different situations. As for the communication, the narrative of colonialism is not that simple as we would like it to be, the way it is perceived here in Africa. And my own expertise is that when they say that this is an imperialistic Russia-Ukraine war, we proceed from the assumption that South Africans and Africans as well, in general, have their notion about the difference between Russia and Ukraine, and that is not that simple. Their understanding is quite, diluted. They know about the sanctions that were started in 2024. And this is when Africans began to look differently at the Russia-Ukraine war. The majority of Africans are young people. They're teenagers. They don't know anything about the former Soviet Union. Russia is not represented here as well as we would like to picture it in Ukraine. So my point is that for us it would be better to zero in on the narratives about the future, what the young people can get from Ukraine, to get the message through that Ukraine is a a progressive technological country. Ukraine means possibility. It's a breakthrough in technology. That is, we have to sell the narratives that appeal to the young people, not so much appealing to the colonial past. The majority of Africans will not remember those times, as we don't remember so much and know so many things about the Second World War. In addition, I would like to model a couple of things that might be of practical value for us. To begin with, let us remember the fact that Ukraine was one of the founding countries of the United Nations. Everyone is aware why Belarus and Ukraine became the founding members of the UN. That does not make us forget that Ukrainian delegation at the United Nations, the state of Israel, would not have existed. Vasyl Tarasenko, the Ukrainian diplomat and representative of Ukraine, was quite active on that front. So we have to be more flexible. For example, I know that tomorrow we'll see the Festival of National Minorities of Ukraine. What precludes us from organizing a Festival of Africa? Perhaps international African students are not present here in Ukraine, but to organize students and school children, they are very much interested in Africa. That interest should be channeled in a good way. And the other thing is that I think Ukrainian grain is a factor to be taken on board in Africa. I think Ukraine will win once President Zelensky holds a press conference under the title Ukrainian Grain. That is, our message should be channeled through a number of ways. Next point. In Kyiv, what used to be the gymnasium for Eastern languages, what does prevent us from setting up a gymnasium for African continent? Of course, we cannot cover all the countries, but you see, we have to act in a language of specific gestures. If we work with some media, then conditionally saying, at least at the national universities, to initiate the study of languages spoken in Africa. And amid the Russia-Ukraine war, I believe this process will forge the formation of the Ukrainian national identity. Of course, we build that identity as a modern state, multinational state, not based on the stereotypes that we used before. That is to say, currently, there are needs of this nature. I have a few thoughts on economics, but I would like to give others a possibility to talk. As for the communications, I think that the initiative we saw in 2023 and 24, when the Ministry for Foreign Affairs organized tours for African diplomats to Bucha and other cities, I think it is an important initiative. When not only Ukrainians talk about this war and its consequences and the famine or the hunger that is looming large in Africa, and grain from Ukraine initiated by President Zelensky was a good initiative. I think this works well when journalists from Africa come here and see the first-hand experience and share this experience. I think these people will be trusted, and they will see the information from the Russian sources, from Russian media, and then they will read the Ukrainian journalists' materials translated into the languages used in Africa. But what is important that the African journalists coming to Ukraine, seeing firsthand the ruins, talking to the relatives of the fallen heroes, such things not only mean the international context. This is a matter of interpersonal relations. It causes empathy. As Dzvinka has suggested, the African population wouldn't know what Ukrainians really are, the way they look, and what is their way of living. But I think the empathic communication should be built on. Communication begins with the interpersonal communication on the things when we understand each other and we feel compassion to each other. I also believe that universities should cooperate, including the Kyiv universities. We have departments at the Institute of International Relations and at the Mahda universities. They are setting up contacts between teachers and students. Of course, journalists should be engaged in this setting up of contents, including the media. We should be influencing very particular groups of people, those who are reading newspapers, to punctuate this message. The grain, of course, Ukrainian grain is important. And people learned about Ukraine in 2022 and 23. This is where Africans learned about Ukraine due to the grain deal. Now this situation has been stabilized after Russia has left the deal. So there was a hunger looming large. It didn't lead to hunger state, but the problems were there. The balancing act, as well as the climate challenges, the issues of deliveries may be fatal. We haven't seen such fatal consequences, including Western African countries. This is the topic we are constantly talking about, and the presidential initiative Grain from Ukraine is important. I would like to talk about the importance of the South African republics. Of course, President and our diplomats and members of parliament visited almost 24 countries. But the visit of the president to South African Republic is very important. Of course, we know that apart from the economic ties, we have cultural and educational ties with that country. The Russia and China ties of that country are also influencing the relations. The party in power, African National Congress, are also tied to Russia, but the opposition holds different view. So there is a prospect. The South African is not a vassal of Russia as Burkina Faso seems to be. This is a country. Of course, it's oriented in a pro-China way. We should enter markets of Kenya and Senegal, but not only then. We should be working with the neutral countries and get our message across to make sure that in that camp they are aware that there is a political wish for us to contact with the Ukrainian countries and to set economic and other relations with Kyiv. Ms. Dzvinka, the floor is yours. I would like to offer a comment. We should not stay apart from African countries. South Africa, of course, is not so vocal in its support of Ukraine. But what matters is that this is a democratic country, a country of the law and uh, equal elections. This is very important, and the rule of law is also important. We know about Romania. We know its position before the election and after the election. That same goes for the South African. After the May of 2024, the government has been different. It would be a mistake to claim that this country is not friendly to Ukraine. All democratic countries are friends of Ukraine, and they must be friends of Ukraine. In our communication, we should position them in a way that this is a country that, according to the legislation of South African, were enjoying good relations with Russia, and legally these relations were severed, which is to say that South Africa is a democratic state. It's not an ideal country, but the first visit of President Zelensky to Africa, and he visited South Africa in the first place, which is a very important country regionally and in the African Union. This is a visit of symbolic nature to get the message through that we are fighting for the ideas shared by Africa. South Africa lived through a hard period of apartheid, and they built a democratic state. As for the information communication, I would like to add that the main issue, both for Ukraine and for the majority of African countries, is the lack of expertise. Hundreds of millions of people speak Swahili on the continent. How many experts are versed in Swahili in Ukraine? You want to open a school where Swahili will be taught. It's a good idea. It's a good thing that the Department for International Relations will have a department for African studies. Kyiv University is engaged in that issue as well, but this will not be done in a blink of an eye. Such an expertise takes years to build, but this must be our first priority. If such an expertise can be built, in Ukraine we don't have such knowledge because dozens of years Africa was not in the focus of Ukrainian focus. The same goes for Africa. Here we don't have that many pundits who are well versed in the Ukrainian things. Academic exchanges must take place. People must be coming here, as well as people must be coming to Ukraine to hear the Ukrainians, to know what they are living through. So the more direct contacts we have, including the scientific and academic challenges. For example, academia must be engaged in a project based not on Russian narratives or quoting British sources of information. We have to establish direct context. This is the way, a best way forward for communication. Let us continue on the diplomacy. We have such dotted gestures, visit of the president, the setting up of 9 embassies, but compare this to the Russian diplomacy activities. We are lagging behind. How important are these things in establishing a authentically, fully fledged diplomacy? In the first place, I believe we have to talk about the fact that Ukraine needs to conduct SWOT analysis of Africa to delineate, break down the figures not only on the export to Africa, but import from Africa. We know that there are countries in Africa that are not that rich. We know about the so-called single-type exports. For example, if there are preferences for fish from the coast of some ex-country, for us it may be a leverage of influence. To paraphrase, a good word and a purse will get you to achieve what far beyond what we can imagine. Climate, for example. Ukraine has a lot of expertise in building hydro facilities and land treatment technologies. That is to say, Ukraine will pay for the work of the engineers coming from Ukraine, but the requests will be coming from Africa. When we talk about Russia, where Russia is imposing the celebration of the 9th of May as a way of this victory hysteria, here is the place where we should tell the African country that we want to be free. It is normal to be free and to be desiring for that freedom. Another issue is that a tandem of Russia and China. The other thing is that, according to my observations, China has overtaken Russia, and they have put the African regimes on the deliveries of armaments and money. We also should be looking for partners. Let's go back to the Ukrainian grain. We cannot import our grain to Poland because of the embargo. Polish diplomacy is quite proactive now that that country is president of the EU. And we help them to implement their ambitions and to enter markets on the continent. I believe there are a lot of genres here and a lot of manifestations. In our discussion, we can put on the table a couple of insights for them to be developed at a later stage. Now, to follow up, for me, the Polish example should be added with the British example and the countries of Commonwealth, because the countries of Commonwealth countries are friendly to Europe, Nigeria and Kenya. In the French zone of impact, Russia has enjoyed a lot of liberty, causing a lot of problems. So through Britain, we can work. They open new bases in eastern coast of Africa, including the Indian Ocean. So it's important to work with the Brits. More to the point that we share with Britain a lot of shared interests. They help us a lot. And of course, Turkey. Turkey is an ambivalent country. It's our strategic partner. And the import of Ukrainian grain goes through their straits. They don't compete with us as Russia does, because the price is the same, quality is the same. For some time, the main competitor of Ukraine is now Russia. It used to be 50-50. Now Russia is taking the lead. Over the year and a half, Russia has overtaken Ukraine on the quotas of grain deliveries. So Turkey as an intermediary is important for us, and they have their humanitarian missions in Sudan and Libya, in western part of the country, in Guinea, and sometimes they conduct humanitarian assistance and sell the drones to those countries. Muslim factor, of course, they want to present themselves as the leader of the Sunnite leader. Of course, in other countries, Turkey is competing with Russia because the current leader is talking about the peaceful negotiations, but in general, pro-Russian forces, including Arab Emirates, are exercising a lot of influence. But Turkey is important factor here. Now that Russia has lost its base in Syria, the stakes of Turkey are growing. Without Turkey, we will not be able to adequately respond to those challenges. I understand that to follow on that message, we have seen a couple of questions here. Oh, I think that Ms. Zirka wants to join that discussion. For Ukrainian diplomacy, the next step, it seems, should be a more detailed and specific modes of cooperation to leave behind the message of our disavowing and condemning the Russian invasion. We should be talking to other countries who are interested in nuclear energy when we talk about the deoccupation of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. South Africa, for example, has its own nuclear power plant. So we have to find specific points to be more active at the regional level where Ukraine is virtually absent. And to be sure, it's not only China and Turkey and Saudi Arabia and other countries are all visible and active here, developing their presence in the African continent. Ukraine, perhaps, should not be using one toolkit to work with all the 54 African countries. We should find mechanisms that are efficient on a specific situation. African Union, for example, we might be engaged in the Nordic countries. They have a lot of experience here. They have a lot of anti-colonial movement associations with these countries on the continent. The Nordic countries always supported historically and now are supportive of the African Union. So we must work out our specific interests with specific African countries. Only then will this cooperation will be more efficient and specific. Now what we are having is that we have a diplomatic presence growing, but such a cooperation asks for to be more specific. Now, Africa should not disappear from the focus of our foreign policy radar. It well may be that once the interest for Africa has appeared, so it's likely it will disappear at some point in time. So we should be working in a systemic way. In a nutshell, as for the systemic cooperation, I think it's important that Ukrainian diplomatic presence is growing. But the issue, again, remains, is the specialists working and able to work in terms of the systemic cooperation and contacts, especially with the countries that have grown on the Ukrainian diplomatic map, including those 9 countries where the ambassadors were only those who were non-residential ambassadors. Now we look for countries and people who are not only interested in paperwork, and such paperwork is always working, but we should be talking to people with a vision. I visited a meeting with a representative of the Ukrainian diplomatic core in Africa. And we talked, one of the topics rather, was what is the current agenda for the diplomatic institutions. I understand we should not be thinking about 54 countries as a single country. But when we raise the issue about the students or PhD students, our council kind of paid lip service because he said later on that this is a complicated issue. People who have now joined the diplomatic corps of Ukraine in Africa and our embassies have been very actively engaged since 2004. But the sad fact is that Ukraine does not have such an expertise or experience in active contacts with African countries. And I think that this process has started, and last year saw a lot of vacancies at the foreign ministry, including the future diplomats to apply for future positions. This is an important and complicated work because it will require a lot of effort from the Ukrainian state. This discussion is very exciting. It is interesting because we want to find approaches to a solution of a difficult issue. In this context, this is what I have thought. It dawned on me that African countries provide a lion's share of blue helmets, that is, military contingent for the peacekeeping operations. I understand that the question of a real presence of peacekeeping forces in Ukraine, but Ukraine can share its dossier among African countries, countries that are actively engaged in blue helmets. That is to say, African representatives might be a compromising figure acceptable for both Russia and Ukraine. This is to say that we should be raising our level of awareness about Ukraine amongst the African countries. Now, I would like to conclude our discussion. Let me remind you that we've been talking about the cooperation. Cooperation presumes a win-win situation both for Ukraine and for Africa. Let us now give an opportunity for every panelist to share 3-point basic things for the Ukrainian-African cooperation to be efficient and for it to enjoy a long life after this war is over. Who would like to begin? I think 3 top priorities include development of a constant, shall I say, economic preconditions for the future. High technologies, high tech, not only grain, but high tech, for this to be sustainable. Secondly, an introduction of the global stabilization in the world, fighting conflicts and countering conflicts. This is a problem that we share with Africa. And introduction of a more equitable world order. And third point, informational understanding of what's going on here and what's going on there. Mr. Mahda, I will try to be aphoristic. Armaments, grain, and peacekeeping. This is quite laconic. I will also to be brief. This is the talk that is directed into the future. Innovation through the Dariia application, through the digitalization of government services, including the energy sector. In Africa, they face including Central Africa, they face a lot of problems there. The population which is growing will require such actions. Ukrainian specialists who are so well versed in renovating our damaged energy system will come in handy in Africa as well. I cannot refrain from mentioning military-industrial cooperation. I believe that Ukraine has a lot to share, especially after we have won in this terrible war. We can share the best lessons and best experiences that we paid for with the lives of our heroes. We should not forget about the cultural cooperation. This is where we should thank the Ukrainian diaspora in Africa. They are doing a very important job locally, regionally, nationally, and internationally. So I believe that Ukrainians should not be hushed. Their voice must be heard. This is how people will learn about us, and this is how we will keep in contact with the national representatives of the African countries. Ms. Dzvinka, would you like to conclude? I would like to echo what has been said by the panelists. I think that economic ties will pay a lot of weight here in terms of systemic presence of Ukraine in Africa. Ukrainian legislation must be improved. Visa system must be improved. This is what the government can do to develop the expertise. Without this, we cannot move forward. Economic cooperation will be quite difficult without the specialists who will be able to develop economic ties. Second point, a global world order, cooperation with the African countries, stressing our shared national interests for the new international systems and architecture of security to be forged. This is where we enjoyed a lot of potential. And the last point, youth, the ways to engage a lot of student population. They are still studying in Ukraine. These are the people who will be our future advocates. Today, they must be taken on board. They will become those who will be communicating with the African countries. We should pay a lot of attention to them. On the 25th of May, we will celebrate the Day of Africa. And those, if you know people living in Africa, write them a message, write them a text. They will be enjoying it. And this will be a contribution of the development of relations between Ukraine and Africa. Thank you, panelists, for this interesting cooperation. We'll be talking about the priorities, challenges, and the path forward of this cooperation. Media Center of Ukraine resumes its work next week. Stay with us. Thank you.